She probably maxed out all her credit cards for this wedding. You know how Maya is with money. I heard my sister Vanessa say it clearly, her voice carrying across the elegant ballroom of the Riverside Estate, where I had just married the love of my life. And the words landed like a physical blow, even though I had been expecting something like this all evening. I was standing near the champagne fountain, 20 feet from where Vanessa held court with our Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert, and I watched her lean in conspiratorially, as if she were sharing some sympathetic concern, rather than spreading poison about me on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I was 28 years old, wearing a dress that had cost more than Vanessa's monthly salary, though she would never know that, and I had just married James Chen, a man who saw me in ways my family never had. The reception was everything I had dreamed of, with 200 guests filling the ballroom, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables dressed in ivory and gold, and a live band that had flown in from New York. But none of that mattered in the moment I heard my older sister casually announce to our relatives that I must be drowning in debt. Vanessa was 32, 4 years older than me, and she had been the golden child for as long as I could remember, the successful one, the daughter our parents boasted about at every family gathering and holiday dinner. She worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, a position she never let anyone forget about, and in our family's eyes, she had always been the one who had her life together, while I was just Maya, the quiet younger sister doing something vague with computers that no one really understood or cared to ask about. I caught James's eye from across the room, and he smiled at me, that warm smile that had made me fall in love with him 2 years ago, completely unaware that my sister was at that very moment explaining to our relatives how financially irresponsible I must be to have thrown such an elaborate wedding. The Riverside Estate was one of the most sought-after venues in Seattle, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sound, and a reputation for hosting only the most elegant events, and watching Vanessa gesture around the room with what I knew was feigned concern. I felt that familiar ache of being fundamentally unseen by the people who were supposed to know me best. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been set so long ago that I could barely remember a time when things had been different, when Vanessa and I had stood on equal ground in our parents' eyes, though maybe that time had never actually existed at all. I was 10 years old when I won a full academic scholarship to Pine Creek Academy, one of the best private schools in Washington state, an achievement that came with a formal ceremony and a letter from the headmaster praising my exceptional intellectual promise. And I remembered running home with the acceptance packet clutched in my hands, bursting through the front door to tell my parents, only to find that Vanessa had received her acceptance letter to Washington State University that same day. She had applied with mediocre grades and average test scores, would be paying full tuition to attend a decent but unremarkable state school, and yet somehow that evening turned into a celebration of Vanessa's achievement, while my scholarship was mentioned briefly as nice for Maya, before the conversation returned to my sister's college plans. My mother had actually said the words, "We're just so relieved Vanessa got in somewhere good," as if there had been real doubt, as if my full scholarship to an elite academy was somehow less worthy of celebration than my sister's acceptance to a safety school. That pattern continued through every milestone of our lives, with Vanessa's ordinary accomplishments celebrated as extraordinary, while my genuine successes were downplayed or ignored entirely. When I graduated top of my class from Pine Creek and got accepted to MIT with another scholarship, my parents threw Vanessa a bigger party for making Dean's List once at Washington State. When I landed my first job in tech at 22, with a starting salary that made my friends' parents jealous, my mother told relatives I was doing some computer stuff, we don't really understand it, while Vanessa's job as a sales associate at a pharmaceutical company was described as a real career with a serious company. I watched my sister get promoted to regional sales manager 3 years ago, a position that came with a decent salary and a company car, and my parents had hosted a dinner party to celebrate, inviting 24 relatives and friends to toast Vanessa's success. And I remembered sitting at that dinner thinking about how I had just closed a major deal at my own company that week, and no one had even asked me how work was going. Now, standing at my own wedding reception, I watched Vanessa lean toward our cousins Jennifer and Michael, gesturing at my dress with a sympathetic smile that made my stomach clench, and I heard her say, "It's actually really pretty for something off the rack. Maya's always been good at finding budget options," even though my dress had been custom designed by Vera Wang and cost $18,000. My mother was nodding along from her seat nearby, that same indulgent expression she always wore when Vanessa held forth, and I saw her lean toward my Aunt Carol and whisper something that made them both glance at the venue with what looked like pity, and I knew she was agreeing with Vanessa's assessment that all of this was quaint, that I had somehow scraped together a wedding that was nice enough, but clearly beyond my means. James materialized at my side, slipping his hand into mine, and when I looked at him, I saw concern in his dark eyes, because he knew my family's patterns, had witnessed them enough times over the past 2 years to recognize when I was hurting, and his gentle squeeze of my hand was both a comfort and a reminder that at least one person in this room truly saw me. What my family did not know, what they had never bothered to ask about or investigate despite 3 years of clues they chose not to see, was that I was a senior consultant at Tech Vision Solutions, one of the largest technology consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest, with a base salary of $240,000 per year, plus performance bonuses that had pushed my total compensation last year to nearly $280,000. I had been promoted to principal consultant just 2 months before the wedding, a position that came with equity options and a clear path to partnership, and over the past 3 years, I had quietly built an investment portfolio worth over $400,000, owned my condo in downtown Seattle outright with no mortgage, and had a savings account that would have made my parents weep if they had ever cared enough to ask about my financial situation. The wedding they were discussing as if it represented my financial ruin. The reception Vanessa was describing to anyone who would listen as evidence of my fiscal irresponsibility had cost $85,000, and I had paid for every single penny of it in cash, writing checks from my personal account without touching credit or taking loans or asking anyone for help. I had never corrected my family's assumptions about my career because some part of me, the part that was still that 10-year-old girl watching her scholarship get overshadowed by her sister's mediocre college acceptance, kept hoping they would eventually ask, would show enough interest in my life to discover the truth on their own, would care enough about me to want to know what I actually did for 40 to 50 hours every week. I told myself I avoided discussing my success because I didn't want to seem like I was bragging, because I valued humility, because money and titles didn't matter to me the way they mattered to Vanessa. But the truth I was only beginning to admit to myself was that I had been waiting for them to see me without me having to demand their attention. Now I watched Vanessa move from our cousins to my Aunt Patricia and Aunt Marie, saw her lean in with that same sympathetic expression, and I heard her say, "I'm actually really worried about her. You know, Maya never thinks ahead. And now she probably has massive debt from all this." Gesturing around the ballroom as if the crystal chandeliers and the live band and the elaborate floral arrangements were evidence of my poor judgment rather than the result of careful financial planning and 3 years of excellent career decisions. My mother was nodding along, adding something I could not quite hear, but which made both aunts glance at me with what looked like pity mixed with judgment, and I felt something shift in my chest, a tightness that had been building all evening suddenly expanding into something closer to anger than hurt. James squeezed my hand again and leaned close to whisper, "We can leave whenever you want. Just say the word." Because he knew my salary, knew about my promotion, knew exactly how much this wedding had cost and how easily I had paid for it. And he had spent 2 years watching my family dismiss and diminish me at every gathering we attended together. but I shook my head because some stubborn part of me wanted to stay, wanted to see this evening through even as my sister continued to broadcast her contempt for me to every relative who would listen. The memory came back with sharp clarity as I watched Vanessa work the room. That dinner 6 months ago, when I had actually tried to share my career news with my family, when I had walked into my parents' house in Bellevue with James beside me, and hope still flickering in my chest that maybe this time would be different. It had been a Sunday evening in late March, the kind of gray Seattle spring day where rain threatened but never quite fell, and my mother had made her usual pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and we had all gathered around the dining room table like we did twice a month, this ritual that was supposed to keep us connected as a family. I had been promoted to principal consultant 3 days earlier, had signed papers that came with a $40,000 salary increase and equity options that my financial advisor said could be worth $500,000 within 5 years. And I had practiced in the car on the way over how I would share the news, keeping it humble but clear, just stating the facts of what I had achieved. We had barely finished saying grace when Vanessa launched into a story about her sales team, about some complicated territory dispute with another regional manager, and she talked for 15 minutes straight while my mother listened with rapt attention and my father made appropriate sympathetic noises. And when there was finally a pause in the conversation, I said, I actually have some career news to share too. I got promoted last week to principal consultant. And I watched my mother's eyes flicker toward me for just a moment before she smiled that vague smile she always gave me and said, That's nice, dear. And then immediately turned back to Vanessa to ask a follow-up question about her sales territories. I had tried again, my voice a little louder, saying, It's actually a pretty significant promotion. It comes with equity in the company. And my father had finally looked up from his phone long enough to say, That's good, Maya, we're happy for you, in the same tone he might have used if I had told him I had gotten a new pair of shoes. And then Vanessa had said something about her company car needing service, and the conversation had moved on as if I had never spoken at all. I remembered sitting there with my pot roast going cold on my plate, James's hand finding mine under the table, and feeling something crack inside my chest as I realized they were never going to ask, were never going to care enough to dig deeper, were never going to see me the way they saw Vanessa, no matter what I accomplished or how clearly I tried to tell them. Now I watched Vanessa approach my college friends Emily and Rachel near the bar, saw her gesturing animatedly, and then I heard her voice carry across the ballroom as she said, Did you guys have to chip in to help Maya cover all this? I know she'd never ask, but I worry about her finances. And I saw both of my friends' faces flush with embarrassment and something close to anger, and Emily said firmly, Maya didn't need anyone's help with anything. But Vanessa just smiled that sympathetic smile and said, It's okay. I know how expensive weddings are. There's no shame in needing support. And I felt something snap inside me. That breaking point I had been approaching all evening, suddenly arriving with force that made my hands shake. The pattern had been there all along, woven through every milestone of my adult life, like a thread of dismissal I had tried not to see. And now as I stood at my wedding reception, watching Vanessa poison the evening with her assumptions about my poverty, all those moments came flooding back with painful clarity. When James and I had announced our engagement 8 months earlier, I had been so happy, had called my parents from the restaurant where he had proposed with the Seattle skyline glittering behind us, and my mother had screamed with joy and said she couldn't wait to start planning. But then 2 days later, when we all met for celebratory dinner at my parents' house, Vanessa had arrived with photos of her new BMW X5, the luxury model with every upgrade, and suddenly the entire evening became about her car and her promotion that came with the car allowance and her success. And when I tried to talk about wedding plans, my mother kept getting distracted, kept circling back to Vanessa's achievements, and by the end of the night, my engagement had become a footnote to my sister's company vehicle. The wedding planning itself had been 4 months of subtle and not-so-subtle criticism, my mother and Vanessa tag-teaming every decision I made with comments about extravagance and fiscal responsibility. My mother saying things like, Are you sure you can afford orchids? Baby's breath is lovely and much more reasonable. And Vanessa chiming in with, "You know, Maya, most people your age are focused on building savings, not throwing expensive parties." As if my wedding was some kind of irresponsible splurge rather than a carefully planned event I could easily afford. I had bitten my tongue through all of it, had let them believe what they wanted to believe, because correcting them felt like boasting, and because some part of me kept hoping they would eventually notice the evidence that surrounded them. The fact that I owned my condo, that I drove a newish Audi, that I took international vacations twice a year, that nothing about my lifestyle suggested financial struggle. The worst moment had come 6 weeks before the wedding at a family barbecue at my Uncle Tom's house in Redmond, with 30 relatives gathered in the backyard on a rare sunny June afternoon, and I had been describing the reception venue to my cousins when Vanessa had pulled me aside near the grill, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, and said, "Maya, I want you to know that if you need help covering wedding costs, I can lend you some money. I know how expensive these things get, and I'd hate for you to start your marriage buried in debt." I had felt my face flush hot, had seen several aunts and uncles turn to look at us, and I had said quietly, "That's really not necessary. I have it covered." But Vanessa had put her hand on my arm with this expression of such patronizing concern and said, "I'm serious, little sister. There's no shame in accepting help. I make good money, and I'm happy to support you. That's what family does." And she had said it so publicly, with such a show of generous concern, that refusing more firmly would have made me look ungrateful or prideful. So I had just thanked her and moved away, and for the rest of that afternoon I had endured sympathetic looks from relatives who clearly believed I was struggling financially, who thought my successful older sister was being kind by offering to bail me out of my irresponsible wedding expenses. I had driven home that evening with James beside me, and I had cried angry tears while he held my hand and asked why I didn't just tell them the truth. Just lay out the facts of my career and my salary, and make them see reality, and I hadn't had a good answer except that I wanted them to care enough to ask, wanted them to see me without me having to force them to look. Now that resentment sat in my chest like a weight. 3 years of being dismissed and overlooked and assumed to be less than I was. And I watched Vanessa continue her performance of concerned older sister, saw her shaking her head sympathetically while talking to more relatives, and I felt something hardening inside me that had been soft and hopeful for far too long. The speeches began just after 8 o'clock, after the dinner plates had been cleared and the sun had finally set behind the Olympics, casting the ballroom in the warm glow of the chandeliers I had chosen specifically because they reminded me of starlight. And James's best man Marcus stood up first with a champagne glass in his hand and told funny stories about their college years at UW, about the time James had accidentally worn 2 different shoes to a final exam because he had been up all night talking to me on the phone, and the room filled with laughter that felt genuine and warm and briefly made me forget about Vanessa's poison that had been spreading through the evening like ink in water. Then it was Sarah's turn, my maid of honor and college roommate, who had lived across the hall from me freshman year and had been there through every milestone since. And she stood up in her dusty rose dress, with tears already shining in her eyes, and she talked about meeting me at 18 when we were both terrified freshmen who didn't know anyone, about how I had helped her through organic chemistry, even though I was a computer science major and had no reason to spend hours tutoring her, about my kindness and my loyalty and my quiet strength that people didn't always see right away, but that was always there underneath. "Maya has this brilliant career," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "She's accomplished so much in tech, and I'm constantly in awe of her success." And she kept it vague the way I had asked her to weeks ago when we had planned the speech, not mentioning specific titles or numbers or details that felt too much like bragging. And I watched Vanessa at the family table roll her eyes dramatically, saw her lean toward my mother with her hand partially covering her mouth, and I didn't need to hear what she said to know it was dismissive. Something about Sarah exaggerating or being a good friend, or me finally having someone who would pretend I was important. My mother nodded slightly at whatever Vanessa had whispered, that tiny gesture of agreement that I had seen so many times throughout my life, and something twisted in my chest that was equal parts hurt and rage. The hurt I had been carrying for years, and the rage that was newer and growing stronger with each passing moment of this reception that was supposed to be about celebrating love, but had become about something else entirely. Sarah finished her speech by saying that James was lucky to have me, and that she knew I was going to continue to do amazing things, and everyone applauded, and I smiled at her with genuine gratitude, because at least someone saw me, at least someone thought I was worth celebrating. And then James leaned close to me and whispered, "Are you okay?" In that way he had of knowing when I was falling apart inside, even when I was smiling on the outside. And I squeezed his hand and nodded, even though we both knew it was a lie, even though the combination of hurt and rising anger in my chest was becoming harder to contain with each passing minute. And I wondered how much longer I could sit there smiling while my sister systematically demolished any dignity I had left in front of everyone I knew. The unexpected moment came at 8:45, just as I was beginning to think the evening couldn't possibly hold any more emotional landmines, when I saw Richard Chen and his wife Linda making their way through the ballroom entrance with apologetic expressions on their faces, and my heart actually lifted for the first time in hours, because I had invited them out of professional courtesy 3 months ago when I sent out the invitations, never really expecting them to come, never imagining my CEO would actually attend his employee's wedding. But here they were, and suddenly I felt less alone in this room full of people who had spent the evening assuming I was broke. Richard was in his mid-50s, distinguished in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and Linda was elegant in navy blue, and they navigated through the tables toward me with warm smiles, and I stood up to greet them, feeling James rise beside me, and Richard clasp my hand in both of his and said, "Maya, I'm so sorry we're late. There was an issue with the flight from San Francisco. But we couldn't miss celebrating you." And his genuine warmth was such a stark contrast to the cold dismissal I'd been feeling from my own family that I felt tears prick my eyes and had to blink them back. "I'm so glad you could make it," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being, and Linda hugged me and congratulated me and told me I looked absolutely beautiful. And for a moment, I was just the bride again, just happy. And then I became aware of Vanessa watching from the family table with a suspicious expression on her face, that look she got when she encountered something she didn't understand and therefore didn't trust. And I saw her lean toward my mother and whisper something while gesturing in our direction. Richard was talking to James now, congratulating him, asking about the honeymoon plans we had mentioned at the company holiday party, and I was explaining that we were going to spend 2 weeks in Thailand, and Richard was saying how much he and Linda had loved Bangkok when they visited 5 years ago, and the conversation was easy and comfortable in the way conversations are when people actually respect you, when they see you as a whole person rather than a collection of assumptions. "I have to tell you," Richard said, lowering his voice slightly and leaning closer, "Monday's presentation to the board went even better than we anticipated. The numbers you put together were exactly what they needed to see." And I nodded, understanding he was referring to the quarterly strategy presentation I'd spent 3 weeks preparing, the one that outlined our expansion plans for the next 18 months. Vanessa appeared at my elbow so suddenly, I almost startled, her smile wide and artificial, and she said, "I'm Vanessa, Maya's sister. I don't think we've met," extending her hand to Richard with that aggressive friendliness she deployed when she was trying to establish dominance in a situation she didn't understand, and Richard shook her hand politely and introduced himself as Richard Chen. "I'm the older sister," Vanessa continued, that phrase she always used as a synonym for the successful one. And she added, "I'm in sales, regional manager for Cascade Marketing Solutions," presenting her credentials the way she always did, needing people to immediately know her status. And Richard nodded and said, "That's wonderful," with professional politeness. But his attention remained primarily on me and James. And I could see confusion flicker across Vanessa's face because she was used to people being impressed by her title, used to commanding the room, and here was this distinguished older man in an expensive suit who seemed much more interested in her supposedly struggling little sister than in her, and she didn't know what to make of it, didn't have the context to understand that Richard wasn't just some random guest, that he represented a world where I had value and worth and recognition that had nothing to do with her narrative about me. The flashback hit me as I watched Richard and Linda make their way to their table. That memory from 3 months ago in early June, when everything had changed. When I had walked into the downtown Seattle offices of Patterson Technologies on a Tuesday morning with my presentation materials and a confidence I didn't entirely feel, prepared to pitch TechVision Solutions' capabilities for their complete digital infrastructure overhaul, a project that had been circulating through the industry for months, with every major consulting firm in the region competing for it, and I had spent 6 weeks preparing that pitch, researching every aspect of Patterson's business, identifying inefficiencies in their current systems, developing a comprehensive strategy that would modernize their entire operation while minimizing disruption to their daily business. And I had stood in that glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor with 7 Patterson executives watching me, and I had delivered the presentation of my life, fielding every question they threw at me, addressing every concern, demonstrating not just technical knowledge but genuine understanding of their business challenges. And 3 days later, Richard had called me into his office and told me we'd won the contract, $15 million, the largest single client acquisition in TechVision's 12-year history. And he had actually stood up and shaken my hand and told me I had a rare gift for translating complex technical solutions into business value that clients could understand and trust. "I'm going to do something special for you at the next company event," he had said, his expression serious and warm at the same time. "Something to recognize what you've accomplished here. Because this isn't just about the money, Maya. This is about the fact that you've set a new standard for what's possible." But he had been cryptic about the details, had smiled mysteriously when I asked what he meant, and I had left his office feeling valued in a way I had rarely felt in my life, certainly not in my family, and I had driven home that evening thinking about calling my parents to share the news, actually reaching for my phone twice before remembering how those conversations always went, how my achievements were met with polite acknowledgement at best and dismissive changing of subject at worst. So I had told James instead, and he had insisted we celebrate properly, had taken me to Canlis and ordered champagne and told me he had never doubted I would do extraordinary things. The memory dissolved as I returned to the present moment of my wedding reception, watching Richard and Linda settle at their table near the dance floor, and I saw Vanessa still watching them with that calculating expression she got when she was trying to figure out an angle, trying to understand the power dynamics in a room, and then she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "Must be nice to splurge when you don't worry about your future, Maya. Some of us have to be responsible with our money, but I guess everyone's entitled to one big blowout even if they're paying for it for years." And something inside me finally cracked, not broke but cracked, like ice that had been frozen solid for decades, finally developing fissures, and I felt the breaking point I had been approaching all evening finally arrive. Felt myself teetering on the edge of either falling apart completely or finding some reserve of strength I didn't know I possessed. James must have seen something in my face because he leaned close immediately and whispered, "We can leave. We can go up to the suite right now if you want. This is our wedding, and we don't owe anyone our presence if they're going to treat you like this." And I loved him so much in that moment for offering me an escape route, for being willing to abandon his own wedding reception if it meant protecting me from more of Vanessa's poison. But I shook my head slowly, something hardening in my chest that felt like resolve, or maybe just exhaustion with playing small to make other people comfortable. The DJ's voice cut through the ambient conversation and music at 9:15, announcing that there would be a special presentation, and I felt James tense beside me as we both assumed this was some surprise element his best man had arranged. Maybe a video montage or a gag gift, something lighthearted to cap off the evening. But then I saw Richard Chen standing near the DJ booth speaking quietly to him, and something in my chest tightened with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Anticipation mixed with apprehension, and then Richard was walking toward the small stage area where the DJ was set up, and he was gesturing for the microphone, and the DJ handed it to him with a smile. And suddenly the entire ballroom was quieting down as guests realized someone was about to speak, and Richard stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, looking every inch the distinguished CEO he was, and he said in that calm, authoritative voice I'd heard in dozens of board meetings, "Good evening, everyone. I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I couldn't let this evening pass without taking a moment to honor the bride." And I felt my heart start to hammer against my ribs because I was beginning to understand that Richard was about to do what he'd promised 3 months ago, that he was going to recognize my achievement publicly, here, now, at my wedding in front of everyone, including my family who had spent the entire evening assuming I was broke. "My name is Richard Chen," he continued, "and I'm the CEO of Tech Vision Solutions." And I saw several guests react to the company name with recognition, saw heads turn and whispers ripple through the tables, because Tech Vision was one of the largest tech consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest, had been featured in Forbes and Fortune, was a name that carried weight in the Seattle business community. And I watched Vanessa's face shift from mild curiosity to confusion to something approaching concern as she realized this wasn't just some random wedding guest making a toast. This was someone significant, someone whose presence here meant something she hadn't anticipated. Richard was still speaking, saying, "I've had the honor and privilege of working with Maya for the past 3 years, and I'm here tonight because I couldn't miss the opportunity to celebrate one of our most exceptional employees." And I saw my mother's expression changing, saw the polite smile she'd been wearing start to falter as she tried to process what she was hearing, tried to reconcile the words, "most exceptional employees," with her mental image of me as someone doing okay, but nothing special. And my father had actually put down his phone and was paying attention for the first time all evening, and Vanessa was sitting very still in her chair with her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Maya," Richard said, looking directly at me with that warm, professional smile, "would you please join me up here?" And it wasn't really a question. It was a gentle command from someone who had every right to make it. And I felt James squeeze my hand once more before releasing it, felt him whisper, "You've got this." As I stood on legs that were trembling so badly, I worried they might not support me. And I was walking toward the stage in my wedding dress, with every eye in the ballroom on me, walking past the family table, where Vanessa sat with her face gone pale, and my mother sat with her mouth slightly open, and my father sat looking confused and concerned. Walking past tables of relatives and friends and colleagues, and I climbed the 3 steps to the small stage area and stood next to Richard, and he smiled at me with genuine pride and warmth, and I realized that this moment, whatever was about to happen, was going to change everything, that there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction my family had constructed about my life, that the truth was about to be laid bare in front of 200 witnesses, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like relief. Richard's speech began with the kind of calm authority that came from years of leading board meetings and investor presentations, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics as he said, "Maya joined Tech Vision Solutions 3 years ago as a junior consultant, and from her very first project it was clear we had someone special on our team." And I stood there beside him feeling exposed and validated simultaneously, my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from shaking as he continued. "In those 3 years, Maya has advanced from junior consultant to senior consultant to principal consultant, a trajectory that typically takes 7 to 10 years in our industry. But Maya isn't typical. She's exceptional. And I could see guests leaning forward in their chairs, fully attentive now, and I could see Vanessa's face going progressively paler with each sentence Richard spoke, could see my mother sitting absolutely motionless at the family table as if she'd been turned to stone, and Richard was saying, 3 months ago, Maya walked into Patterson Technologies and delivered a presentation that secured Tech Vision Solutions a $15 million contract, the largest single client acquisition in our company's 12-year history. And the number hung in the air like something solid and undeniable. $15 million. And I heard gasps from several tables, heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," loud enough to carry, and Richard smiled at me warmly before continuing. But it's not just about the numbers. Though the numbers are certainly impressive, it's about the way Maya approaches every challenge with a combination of technical brilliance, strategic thinking, and genuine care for solving our clients' real problems. She has a gift for translating complex technical solutions into language that business leaders can understand and trust, and that gift has made her invaluable not just to Tech Vision, but to every client she's ever served. And I felt tears pressing at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to cry in this moment that was about strength and achievement. And I glanced at the family table and saw my father actually paying full attention for what might have been the first time in years. Saw Vanessa gripping her champagne glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. Saw my mother's carefully maintained expression of pleasant interest crumbling into something like shock. Richard's voice grew even more formal, more ceremonial, as he said, "Which is why it gives me tremendous pleasure to announce, here among the people who love and support Maya, that as of Monday morning she will hold the title of Vice President of Client Strategy, making her the youngest Vice President in Tech Vision Solutions history." And the applause that erupted was deafening, people actually rising from their chairs in a standing ovation, and Richard had to raise his voice slightly to be heard as he continued, "This promotion comes with a compensation package of $320,000 annually, plus equity participation that will make Maya a part owner of the company she's helped to build." And I was standing there in complete shock, because while I'd known about the VP promotion, Richard had told me we'd discuss the details after my honeymoon. I hadn't known the exact salary figure, hadn't known about the equity package, and the reality of what he was announcing was washing over me in waves. $320,000. Equity ownership. Vice president. Youngest in company history. And I could barely process it. Could barely stand upright under the weight of this public recognition I had never sought but apparently desperately needed. And the applause continued, rolling through the ballroom like thunder. And I finally let myself look directly at Vanessa and saw that her face had gone from pale to almost gray. Saw her sitting frozen in her chair while everyone around her stood and applauded. And I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite vindication, but was perhaps simply the acknowledgement of a truth that had always existed, but had never been spoken aloud. Richard wasn't finished, and as the applause began to fade, he raised his hand slightly and smiled, saying, "There's more." And the room quieted again with an anticipatory energy that felt almost electric, and I stood there beside him wondering what else he could possibly say, after already announcing my promotion and compensation in front of 200 people, and then he was reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a long envelope, cream-colored and formal, and he said, "Maya, in recognition of your extraordinary achievement with the Patterson Technologies contract, the board of directors has authorized a performance bonus." And he handed me the envelope and said clearly enough for the microphone to pick up, $50,000, which I'm presenting to you tonight because we wanted you to know on your wedding day just how valued you are. And I took the envelope with hands that had gone numb. $50,000. A bonus that was nearly what I'd earned in my entire first year out of college, and the applause erupted again, louder this time, and Richard was still talking, saying something about how the bonus was just one form of recognition, how my work had earned attention beyond Tech Vision's walls, and he mentioned that Tech Leadership magazine would be featuring me in their Rising Stars Under 30 profile series next month, how the interview had already been conducted and the article was going to press. And I remembered that interview from 2 weeks ago but hadn't realized it was for such a prominent feature, and several guests were actually pulling out their phones now, recording this moment, capturing my stunned expression and Richard's proud smile, and he was saying, Maya has also been invited to deliver the keynote address at the Pacific Northwest Technology Conference in September, where she'll be speaking to over 2,000 industry professionals about innovative client engagement strategies. And I had known about the conference invitation, but hearing Richard announce it here, now, in front of everyone, including my family, who had spent years dismissing my computer stuff as unremarkable, felt surreal and overwhelming and vindicating all at once. And the guests were standing again, a second standing ovation, and I could see my college friends, Sarah and Jennifer and Marcus, literally cheering, pumping their fists in the air, because they had known about my success, had celebrated my victories over late-night phone calls and weekend brunches, had been sworn to secrecy at my request, because I hadn't wanted to deal with family drama, and now they were watching that secret become gloriously, irreversibly public, and their joy for me was written all over their faces, and camera phones were everywhere, at least a dozen people recording, and I knew that this moment was being captured and would be shared and would exist as permanent documentation of the truth I had hidden for so long. And I looked at the family table and saw Vanessa sitting completely frozen, the only person in the entire ballroom who wasn't applauding, wasn't smiling, was just sitting there with her champagne glass still in her hand and her face gone slack with shock. And beside her, my mother sat with her mouth literally hanging open, her careful social mask completely shattered. And my father was actually standing and clapping, though his expression was confused and perhaps ashamed, as if he was only now realizing how thoroughly he had misunderstood his own daughter's life. And Richard turned to me and opened his arms and pulled me into a warm, professional hug, the kind a proud mentor gives a protege. And his wife, Linda, had come up to the stage and she hugged me too, and she whispered, "You deserve all of this and more." And then they were descending the stairs and returning to their table, and I was left standing there alone on the small stage with the microphone still live and the Crystal Award in one hand and the envelope containing $50,000 in the other, and 200 pairs of eyes on me. And I had a choice to make about what I would say next, how I would handle this moment that felt both triumphant and terrifying, whether I would be gracious or pointed, forgiving or honest. And I realized that whatever I said in the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that came after. I took a breath and brought the microphone closer to my lips, and my voice came out steadier than I expected as I said, "Thank you, Richard, for those incredibly generous words, and for this recognition that I honestly had no idea was coming tonight." And there was warm laughter from the guests at my obvious surprise, and I continued, "I want to talk for just a moment about the past 3 years, because they've been the most challenging and rewarding years of my professional life." And I found myself looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar and some less so, and I said, "When I started at Tech Vision Solutions, I was terrified. I had come from a smaller firm, and suddenly I was working with major corporations on multi-million-dollar projects. And there were many nights when I sat at my desk at 9 or 10 o'clock, wondering if I was good enough, if I belonged in those boardrooms and strategy sessions. And I could feel the room's attention, complete and focused." And I continued, "But what I discovered was that when you love what you do, when you find work that genuinely fulfills you and allows you to solve real problems for real people, that passion carries you through the fear and the doubt." And my voice was growing stronger now, more confident, and I said, "I love what I do. I love the puzzle of understanding a client's needs and designing solutions that transform their business. I love the moment when a CEO's eyes light up because they finally see a path forward, and I found that work deeply meaningful even when others didn't quite understand it." And those last words came out with just the slightest edge, not quite pointed, but not quite neutral either. And I let my gaze drift to the family table where Vanessa sat frozen, and my mother looked like she'd been slapped, and my father was actually paying attention, perhaps for the first time all evening, perhaps for the first time in years, and I turned deliberately away from them and found James in the crowd, my husband of 6 hours, and I said, I want to thank my husband James, who has believed in me from the day we met, who has listened to me talk through complex projects at midnight and celebrated every victory no matter how small, who has never once questioned my worth or my capabilities. And James's eyes were bright with emotion and pride, and I continued, I want to thank my friends, especially Sarah and Jennifer and Marcus, who have been my cheerleaders and my support system, and who have always seen me clearly. And the three of them were beaming at me, Sarah actually wiping tears from her eyes. And I said, I want to thank Richard and Linda Chen for taking a chance on me 3 years ago, and for creating an environment where hard work and innovation are genuinely valued. And I paused. And in that pause there was weight and significance. And I said, I'm grateful to everyone here tonight who has supported me, who has believed in me, who has taken the time to actually ask about my life and listen to the answers. And the emphasis on those last words was slight but unmistakable, a pointed acknowledgement of those who had done these things and an equally pointed recognition of those who had not. And what I didn't say hung in the air as powerfully as what I did say, the absence of gratitude to my family speaking volumes to everyone in that ballroom who had heard Vanessa's cutting comments throughout the evening. And I finished with, this has been the most extraordinary day of my life, marrying the love of my life and receiving this incredible recognition, and I'm so happy to share it with all of you. And I raised the crystal award slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement, and the applause erupted again, and I carefully descended the stairs from the small stage, Richard reaching out a steadying hand as I navigated the steps in my wedding dress, and I returned to our table where James immediately stood and pulled me into his arms. And he whispered against my hair, I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. And I held on to him for a moment, letting his solid presence ground me after the surreal experience of standing in front of 200 people while my professional success was announced and my family's years of dismissal were implicitly exposed. And when I pulled back and sat down, I could feel the shift in the room's energy, could sense guests looking at me with new eyes, with respect and interest that hadn't been there before. And I glanced toward the family table and saw Vanessa staring at her plate, saw my mother leaning close to her whispering something urgent, saw my father looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shame and wonder, and I realized that everything had changed. That there was no going back to the old dynamic where I was the overlooked younger daughter and Vanessa was the success story, that the truth was out now and it was permanent and documented on a dozen cell phone videos that were probably already being uploaded to social media, and I felt simultaneously liberated and terrified, vindicated and sad, because I had wanted this recognition, but I had also wanted it to come with my family's genuine pride. And now I had the recognition, but their pride felt forced and false, born of public revelation rather than private knowing. The moment I sat down, the energy around our table shifted completely, and within seconds, people were approaching to congratulate me, guests who had been at the ceremony and cocktail hour, but whom I hadn't really spoken to during the reception. And now they were seeking me out with genuine interest in their eyes. And the first was James's colleague, David, who worked in finance and who said, Maya, I had no idea you were at Tech Vision Solutions. That's incredible. They're one of the most innovative firms in the region. And he was asking me about the Patterson contract and about my role in the company's strategy division, questions that demonstrated actual knowledge of my industry and genuine curiosity about my work. And right behind him came my Aunt Teresa, my mother's younger sister, who had barely said hello to me during the receiving line, but who was now beaming and saying, I'm so proud of you, sweetie, vice president at your age. That's remarkable. And her enthusiasm felt hollow because I remembered her nodding along earlier when Vanessa had made a comment about the wedding flowers being practical choices, implying I'd gone budget. But I smiled and thanked her because what else could I do? And then came a wave of James's relatives, his aunt and uncle from Portland, his cousin Rebecca, who worked in marketing, all of them treating me with a new level of respect that was both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable because James's parents had known about my success all along, had treated me with warmth and respect from the day we met. And I realized that their extended family had probably heard about my career, but were only now seeing it confirmed and validated by Richard's public announcement. And Rebecca was saying, "I'd love to pick your brain about client engagement strategies. I'm working on a campaign right now that could really benefit from your perspective." And I found myself falling into professional mode, discussing broad concepts while she listened intently, and more guests kept coming. A steady stream of people who suddenly found me fascinating. And I caught a glimpse of the family table where Vanessa sat in quiet conversation with my mother, both of them leaning close, Vanessa's face tight with what looked like anger or humiliation or both, and my mother's expression was harder to read, somewhere between shock and calculation, as if she was trying to figure out how to reframe this new information to fit her existing narrative, and my father was not at the table. And I scanned the ballroom and found him standing near the bar, watching me from a distance. And when our eyes met, he started walking toward me with a hesitant determination. And the guests around me sensed something and began to drift away, giving us space. And my father reached our table and stood there for a moment, looking awkward and uncertain, and he said, "Maya, that was quite an announcement." And his voice was careful, measured, and he continued, "I didn't realize you'd done so well for yourself. I mean, I knew you worked in technology, but I didn't understand the scope of it." And James tensed slightly beside me, his hand finding mine under the table, a protective gesture, and I looked at my father and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Because this was the man who had been physically present, but emotionally absent for most of my life, who had let my mother and Vanessa dominate family dynamics, while he retreated into his phone and his workshop and his emotional distance. And I said with careful politeness, "Thank you, Dad." And he seemed to want to say more, his mouth opening and closing once. And finally he said, "I should have paid more attention. I should have asked you about your work." And it wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer than anything my mother or Vanessa had offered. And I said, "Yes, you should have." And my voice was cool but not cruel, honest but not harsh. And he nodded slowly and said, "Congratulations on everything, the wedding, the promotion, all of it." And then he retreated back toward the bar. And James squeezed my hand and whispered, "You okay?" And I nodded because I was. I was more than okay. I was starting to feel something like freedom. About 20 minutes later, I had excused myself from yet another conversation with one of James's distant relatives and was standing near the dessert table considering whether I could face eating anything, given the anxious knot still tight in my stomach, when I sensed someone approaching from my left, and I turned to find Vanessa standing there. And her face was carefully composed, but I could see the tension in her jaw and the tightness around her eyes. And she said in a voice that was attempting casual, but landing somewhere closer to strained, "So, that was quite a surprise, your boss making that announcement." And I just looked at her, waiting. Because I knew her well enough to know that this opener was leading somewhere, and she continued, "Why didn't you ever tell us about your job, about what you actually do?" And her tone suggested that my silence had been the problem, that I had somehow wronged her by not sharing, and I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of calm clarity, and I said quietly, "I tried to tell you, Vanessa, many times." And she made a dismissive gesture with her hand and said, "I mean really tell us, not just mention it in passing." And I said, still in that same calm voice, "I tried to tell you at Christmas dinner 2 years ago when I got my first major promotion. You interrupted me after one sentence to talk about your sales numbers." And I watched her face tighten. And I continued, "I tried to tell Mom and you at lunch last spring when I landed the Patterson contract. Mom changed the subject to ask about wedding cake flavors." And Vanessa's expression was shifting now from casual to defensive, and she said, "Well, if it was so important, you should have insisted. You've always been so quiet about everything. How were we supposed to know?" And I felt the familiar pull to back down, to smooth things over, to accept that somehow my communication style was the problem. But something had changed in me in the past hour. Something had crystallized when I stood on that stage holding a crystal award and realized that my worth existed independent of my family's recognition of it, and I said, "You could have asked, you could have at any point in the past 3 years asked me a single genuine question about my work." And Vanessa's face flushed, and she said, "That's not fair. I ask about your life." And I said, "You ask in a way that assumes the answer isn't important. You ask, and then you start talking before I can finish answering." And her mouth opened and closed, and then she said with more heat entering her voice, "This is just like you, Maya, making everything about how you're ignored and overlooked. You always played the victim." And I felt the words land, but they didn't wound the way they might have even this morning, and I said, "I'm not playing anything, I'm stating facts." And she said, "You planned this, didn't you? You had your boss come here and make this big announcement to embarrass me in front of everyone." And her voice was rising slightly, and I could see a few guests glancing our way, and I said very clearly and very calmly, "I didn't plan any of that, Vanessa. I didn't even know Richard was coming tonight. He RSVP'd regrets." And she said, "Oh, please, that whole thing was perfectly staged. The award, the check, the speech about your amazing career." And she said the word amazing with such bitterness that it was almost shocking. And I said, "What exactly are you angry about? That I'm successful, or that you didn't know about it?" And she stared at me and said, "I'm angry that you made me look like an idiot." And there it was. The truth finally, not concern about our relationship or hurt that I hadn't confided in her, but anger at being embarrassed, at the power dynamic shifting in public, and I said quietly, "You made yourself look like an idiot by spending the entire evening telling people I was broke, by offering to lend me money, by criticizing my choices without having any actual information about my financial situation." And her face went very red and she said, "I was trying to help you." And I said, "No, Vanessa, you were trying to maintain your position as the successful sister, and you did it by putting me down." The silence that fell between us after those words lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt much longer, and I watched Vanessa's face cycle through shock and anger and something that might have been hurt, and she said in a voice that was shaking slightly, "That's not true. I never tried to put you down. I was just being realistic about what I thought your situation was." And I said very calmly, "You never asked what my situation was, you assumed, and you made those assumptions public and humiliating." And I gestured around the ballroom where guests were still mingling, where people were probably still talking about Richard's announcement, and I continued, "You told Aunt Teresa I must have maxed out credit cards for this wedding. You told cousins that my dress was budget and the venue was quaint. You asked my friends if they had to chip in for expenses, and you did all of that without having a single actual conversation with me about my finances or my career." And Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but I kept going because something had broken open inside me, and 3 years of swallowed words were finally coming out. And I said, "And the thing is, Vanessa, I don't even think you did it maliciously. I think you did it automatically, because you needed me to be the struggling little sister, so you could be the successful big sister, and you never questioned whether that story was still true or whether it had ever been completely true." And she was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between recognition and rejection, and she said, "You're being dramatic. You're making this into something it's not." And I felt a surge of frustration, because even now, even after everything, she was dismissing my experience. And I said, "I told you I secured a $15 million contract, and you barely reacted. Do you remember that? It was at lunch in April." And I watched her face go blank as she tried to recall. And she said uncertainly, "I don't remember that." And I said, "Exactly. You don't remember because you weren't listening, because you'd already decided that nothing I did professionally could be that important." And I took a breath and felt something settle in my chest, a kind of certainty I'd never felt before with my family. And I said quietly but very clearly, I don't need you to understand my career, Vanessa. I don't need you to celebrate my success or even acknowledge it. Because I've realized something tonight. I've realized that I've been waiting my whole life for you and Mom to see me clearly, and you're not going to, and that's okay. Because your inability to see my worth doesn't diminish my worth. And Vanessa actually stepped back slightly, as if my words had physical force. And her face showed pure shock, because I had never in our entire lives spoken to her like this, with this kind of calm certainty. And she said, Maya, and then stopped, and I could see her struggling. And finally she said, You've changed. And it sounded almost like an accusation. And I said, Yes, I have. And I realized as I said it that it was true, that something fundamental had shifted in me, standing on that stage. And I said, I don't need your approval anymore. I needed it for so long, but I don't need it now. And Vanessa's eyes were bright with what might have been tears or might have been anger, and she said, Fine, if that's how you want it. And she turned and walked away toward where our mother was standing with Aunt Teresa, and I stood there by the dessert table holding a small plate I didn't remember picking up. And I felt James's presence before I saw him, and he was there beside me saying quietly, You okay? And I nodded, because I was. I was more okay than I'd been in years. I was standing there with James beside me trying to process what had just happened with Vanessa, when I saw my mother detaching herself from Aunt Teresa and walking toward us with that particular expression she wore when she was about to manage a situation, and I felt my stomach tighten because I knew what was coming. And she arrived with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, Maya, honey, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. And her voice had that soothing quality she used when she wanted to smooth over conflict without actually addressing it. And I looked at her and said quietly, What misunderstanding, Mom? And she glanced around as if checking who might overhear and said, Well, with your sister, she's just surprised. We all are. We had no idea you were doing so well. And she said it as if my success was the surprising part, rather than their complete lack of awareness of my life. And I felt James shift slightly beside me in a gesture of support, and I said, I tried to tell you. I tried to tell you many times. And my mother made a dismissive gesture with her hand and said, Oh, honey, you know how busy family gatherings are. Everyone talking at once. It's easy for things to get lost in the shuffle. And I looked at her directly and said, It wasn't just at family gatherings, Mom. It was at lunch last April when I told you about the Patterson contract, and you changed the subject to ask about wedding cake flavors. And I watched her face tighten slightly, and I continued. It was at Christmas 2 years ago when I tried to tell you about my promotion, and you started talking about Vanessa's sales award before I could finish my second sentence. And my mother's expression was shifting from smoothing to defensive, and she said, Maya, that's not fair. I've always supported both my daughters equally. I've always been interested in both your lives. And I felt something crack inside me because that statement was so fundamentally untrue, and yet I could see that she believed it, and I said as gently as I could manage, Mom, when was the last time you asked me a specific question about my work? Not just, how's work, but an actual question about what I do or what projects I'm working on. And she opened her mouth and then closed it, and I could see her trying to remember, and finally she said, I ask about your work all the time. But her voice lacked certainty, and I said, You ask Vanessa detailed questions about her sales territories and her team and her quarterly numbers. You asked her about her work for 20 minutes at Easter dinner. You asked me if work was going okay, and when I started to answer, you remembered you needed to check on the ham. And my mother's face was flushing now, and she said, You're remembering things wrong, you're upset, and you're making this bigger than it is. And I shook my head and said very clearly, I'm remembering things exactly right, Mom, and I'm not upset. I'm just finally saying what's been true for years. And I could see other relatives pretending not to watch from nearby tables. And James's hand found mine and squeezed, and my mother said, I don't know what you want me to say, Maya. I'm sorry if you felt overlooked, but that was never my intention. And I said, I don't need your intentions, Mom. I need you to acknowledge what actually happened. And I watched her struggle with this, watched her face move through several expressions, and finally she said, You're different tonight. You're being very harsh. And I realized she was right. I was different, because I had finally stopped waiting for her validation, and the absence of that need had given me a clarity I'd never had before, and I said quietly, I'm being honest, maybe for the first time. And my mother looked at me as if I were a stranger. And in that moment, I understood that she might never be able to see me clearly, that her need to maintain her narrative about equally supporting both daughters was stronger than her ability to acknowledge reality, and I felt James beside me solid and real, and I knew I didn't need her to understand, because I finally understood myself. My mother was still standing there looking at me, as if I were someone she didn't quite recognize, when I saw my father approaching from the bar area where he'd been talking with James's uncle. And his expression was different from the awkward congratulations he'd offered earlier, something more genuine in the set of his shoulders. And when he reached us, my mother said, David, talk to your daughter. She's being very difficult about a simple misunderstanding. But my father didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me and said quietly, Maya, can I talk to you for a minute? And there was something in his tone that made me nod, and my mother said, David, we need to present a united front here. But he said gently, Linda, give us a moment. And she looked between us with an expression of surprise and irritation before walking back toward Aunt Teresa. And my father gestured toward the quieter corner near the windows overlooking the garden, and James squeezed my hand and said, I'll be right over there, and moved to give us space. And my father and I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the evening light was starting to fade into dusk, and he was quiet for a long moment looking out at the garden. And finally he said, I didn't pay enough attention, and his voice was rough with something that might have been shame, and I waited because I'd learned tonight that silence could be powerful, and he continued, to your career, to what you were doing, I just assumed you were okay, doing fine but nothing special, and I realize now that assumption was lazy and unfair. And I felt something shift in my chest, because this was different from my mother's defensiveness or Vanessa's deflection. This was actual acknowledgement. And I said quietly, Dad, you were on your phone through most family dinners. You barely asked about my life. And he nodded and said, I know, I was checked out. I told myself I was tired from work, but that's an excuse. I should have been present. And he finally looked at me directly, and I could see real regret in his eyes. And he said, Tell me about your work. Actually, tell me. I want to understand what you do. And I felt tears prick my eyes, because this was what I'd wanted for so long. Someone in my family to actually ask and actually listen. And I started slowly explaining client strategy and enterprise solutions and the Patterson contract. And he listened without interrupting, asking questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand. And I talked for maybe 5 minutes about my work, and he nodded and said, $15 million, that's extraordinary, Maya. That's really extraordinary. And his voice held pride that sounded real, and I said, I tried to tell you about it at Easter. And he closed his eyes briefly and said, I don't remember, and that's the problem, isn't it? I should remember. And we stood there in silence for a moment. And across the ballroom, I could see Vanessa talking intensely with my mother, both of them looking over at us occasionally. And my father said, Your sister is struggling with this. Your mother too. They've built up this idea of how the family works, and this doesn't fit. And I said, And you? And he said, I'm trying to see clearly, maybe for the first time in a long time. And he paused and added, I'd like to have coffee with you sometime. Actually hear about your life, if you're willing. And I looked at this man who'd been physically present but emotionally absent through so much of my childhood, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, a willingness to try. And I said, I'd like that. And he nodded and said, Thank you for giving me a chance I probably don't deserve. And he squeezed my shoulder awkwardly and walked back toward the bar. And I stood there by the windows feeling something complicated, Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of possibility. And I could see the split in my family forming clearly now, my father moving toward understanding while my mother and Vanessa remained locked in their need to maintain their version of reality. And I realized I could accept that split, could build something with the people willing to actually see me, while releasing my need for recognition from those who couldn't. The reception was winding down by the time I walked back to where James was standing near our sweetheart table. And the ballroom that had been so full of energy during Richard's announcement now felt quieter as some guests began gathering their things and saying their goodbyes. And James looked at me with such understanding in his eyes and said softly, "How are you holding up?" And I didn't have a simple answer because I was feeling so many things at once. And we sat down at our table, and he kept his hand in mine, and I said, "I don't know. I feel like I should be happy. I got everything I thought I wanted. Everyone saw the truth, but I also feel sad." And he nodded and said, "You can feel both things, you know. It's not one or the other." And I looked out at the remaining guests and saw Sarah and my other college friends laughing together near the bar, saw Richard and his wife speaking warmly with James's parents, saw the colleagues from work who'd stayed for the whole reception, treating me with respect that felt genuine, and I also saw Vanessa gathering her purse with sharp, angry movements, and my mother beside her looking strained and diminished. And I said to James, "I got the public recognition I never thought I needed, but I realized I lost something with them too." And then I stopped and corrected myself. "No, that's not right. I didn't lose it tonight. It was never really there, was it?" And James squeezed my hand and said, "I don't think so. Not the way you needed it to be." And I felt tears building but not falling, and I said, "Is that terrible? That I'm sad about losing something that maybe never existed?" And he said, "That's not terrible. That's human. You're grieving what you wished you had, not what you actually had." And I loved him so much in that moment for understanding exactly what I meant. And he said, "Look around at everyone who's still here, Maya. Look at the people who stayed and who are celebrating you genuinely." And I did look, and I saw Sarah catching my eye and blowing me a kiss, saw James's mother beaming at us from across the room, saw my father standing alone near the windows looking thoughtful rather than checked out, saw my team lead Michael talking animatedly with James's brother about the work I'd done on the Patterson contract, and James said quietly, "This is your family, the one you chose, and the ones who chose you, the ones who see you clearly." And I understood what he meant about chosen family versus blood family, and how sometimes the former matters more than the latter. And I was starting to formulate this thought about worth being independent of family validation when I saw Vanessa and my mother heading toward the exit without coming to say goodbye. And I watched them walk away and felt something twist in my chest, but also something release. And James said, "Let them go." And I nodded because he was right, and my father caught my eye from across the room and raised his hand in a small wave, and I waved back. And that small gesture felt significant somehow. One person from my original family willing to stay until the end, and the DJ was playing slower songs now as the staff began quietly clearing some tables, and James said, "Do you want to dance?" And I said yes. And we moved to the nearly empty dance floor, and he held me close, and we swayed to music I wasn't really hearing. And I let myself feel everything, the vindication and the grief and the relief and the sadness and the hope. And I thought about how tonight I'd finally been seen by everyone, but the most important thing was that I'd finally seen myself clearly, seen my worth independent of whether my mother acknowledged it or whether Vanessa respected it. And James whispered, "I'm so proud of you, not for the VP position or the contract, but for how you handled tonight, for standing up for yourself." And I held him tighter and said, "I couldn't have done this without you." And he said, "Yes, you could have, but I'm honored I got to be here to witness it." And the song ended, and we walked back to our table hand in hand. And I knew the hardest conversations were behind me now, and whatever came next would be on my terms. The hotel suite was quiet and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, and I kicked off my heels the moment we walked through the door, while James loosened his tie, and we both stood there for a moment in the sudden stillness, after hours of noise and emotion and performance, and he said, "You want to change? Get comfortable?" And I nodded, and went to the bedroom where my overnight bag was waiting with the clothes I'd packed what felt like a lifetime ago when I was still just anxious about the wedding going smoothly. And I changed into soft pajama pants and one of James's t-shirts, and washed off my makeup, and let my hair down from the elaborate updo that had taken 2 hours that morning. And when I came back out, James had changed too, and ordered room service tea, and was sitting on the couch looking at his phone. And he said, "You're already all over social media, Richard's announcement. People are sharing videos." And he showed me his screen where I could see myself standing on that stage looking shocked, while Richard talked about the Patterson contract, and I sat down beside him and pulled out my own phone, which I hadn't looked at since before the reception started. And the notifications were overwhelming, dozens of texts and emails and LinkedIn messages, and I started scrolling through them with James reading over my shoulder. And there were messages from colleagues at TechVision congratulating me on the VP position. Several people from the industry I'd met at conferences saying they'd seen the videos and asking if I'd speak on panels, former professors from college reaching out to say they'd always known I'd do well, and my college friends had created a group chat that was full of celebration and several pointed comments about my family's reactions, and Sarah had written, "That's my girl, you handled that with so much grace, I'm so proud of you." And I felt warmth spread through my chest reading all these messages from people who genuinely valued me. And then I noticed what was missing, and I said to James, "Nothing from Vanessa or my mother." And he said gently, "Did you expect there to be?" And I said, "No, I guess not." And I kept scrolling, and then I saw a text from my father that had come through about 20 minutes ago, and it was longer than his usual messages, which were typically just a few words, and it said, "Maya, I want to apologize for not seeing you clearly all these years. I made assumptions that were lazy and unfair. I'd like to take you for coffee next week and actually hear about your life, if you're willing to give me that chance. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago. Dad?" And I read it twice and felt tears start to fall before I even realized I was crying. And James put his arm around me, and I leaned into him and cried properly for the first time that day. All the emotion I'd been holding back through the reception and the confrontations and the public vindication finally releasing. And I cried for the little girl who brought home perfect report cards that no one really looked at, and the teenager whose scholarship was treated as less important than her sister's mediocre acceptance letter, and the young woman who tried to share her promotion news at Easter dinner and was ignored. And I cried for all the years I spent believing maybe I wasn't worth paying attention to, and all the energy I'd wasted hoping they'd finally ask about my life. And James just held me and didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just let me feel everything I needed to feel, and eventually the tears slowed, and I wiped my eyes and said, "My father wants to have coffee." And James said, "I saw. How do you feel about that?" And I said, "I don't know. Hopeful, maybe? Scared? Is it stupid to hope he actually means it this time?" And James said, "It's not stupid. Hope is never stupid." And he stayed until the end tonight. That counts for something. And I nodded and typed back a response to my father saying, "Yes, I'd like that. Let me know when works for you." And hit send before I could overthink it. And then I put my phone down on the coffee table face down because I needed a break from all the messages and notifications, and James poured tea for both of us, and we sat there in comfortable silence for a while. And I thought about how this morning I'd woken up as one version of myself, and now I was ending the day as someone different, someone who'd finally been seen by everyone, but more importantly had finally seen herself clearly. And the room service tea was chamomile and honey, and exactly what I needed. And James said, "I love you, you know that, right? Not because you're a VP or because you landed a huge contract, but because of who you are." And I said, "I know, and that's why I married you." And he smiled and said, "Good reason." And we sat there together as the city lights glowed outside our window, And I felt the beginning of something I hadn't felt in a long time when it came to my family, not closure exactly, but maybe peace, maybe acceptance that some relationships would heal and some wouldn't. And that was okay because I was enough regardless. I had always been enough, and tonight I'd finally started to believe it. 3 months had passed since my wedding day, and I was sitting in my corner office at Tech Vision Solutions, with floor to ceiling windows overlooking downtown, and a view I still hadn't gotten used to. And my calendar was open on my computer screen, showing back to back meetings for the week, including the final preparation session for the National Tech Innovation Conference, where I'd be giving the keynote address on Friday. And I felt a mixture of excitement and nerves that was becoming familiar as I stepped more fully into this VP role that had transformed my daily life in ways both practical and profound. And my phone buzzed with a text from my father saying, "Still on for coffee Thursday morning?" Which would be our fifth meeting since the wedding, and these coffee dates had become something I looked forward to cautiously. Conversations where he actually asked questions and listened to answers and was slowly getting to know who I really was, rather than who he'd assumed I was. And it wasn't perfect, and sometimes it was awkward, and we were essentially starting from scratch, but it was real, and that mattered more than I'd expected it to, and I typed back, "Yes, see you at 9 a.m., and then looked at the framed photo on my desk of James and me from our honeymoon in Italy, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said, and I thought about how my life had split into a clear before and after, with that wedding reception as the dividing line. The stack of papers on my desk included the agenda for tomorrow's executive team meeting, where I'd be presenting the Q3 strategy for client retention, and my assistant had left a note that the reporter from Tech Industry Today wanted to schedule the follow-up interview for the feature article that would run next month. And my team had grown from the 3 people I'd managed as principal consultant to 12 people now as VP, and I was learning leadership in ways that challenged me daily, but also fulfilled something I hadn't known I needed. And Richard had told me last week that the board was extremely impressed with my vision for the department, and that I should start thinking about what I wanted my next 5 years to look like. There was a letter in my desk drawer that I'd read only once, the formal apology my mother had sent about 3 weeks after the wedding. 2 pages of careful language acknowledging she hadn't been as attentive as she should have been, and hoping we could move forward. And I'd responded politely, thanking her for the letter, but I hadn't suggested getting together, and she hadn't pushed, and we were in this strange, distant holding pattern where we were technically in contact but not really connected. And I'd made peace with the possibility that this might be as good as it got with her, because some people couldn't adapt their narrative even when presented with undeniable evidence. I'd heard through my aunt that Vanessa was still angry, had told relatives I'd deliberately humiliated her at my wedding, and we hadn't spoken since that night, and I didn't miss her, which told me everything I needed to know about what that relationship had actually been. And it still hurt sometimes when I thought about the sister relationship I'd wished we had versus the reality of what it was. But the hurt was duller now, more like an old bruise than a fresh wound. My phone rang, and it was James calling from his office across town, and I answered with, "Hey you," and he said, "How's your day going?" And I said, "Busy, good busy though. I'm going over the conference presentation." And he said, "You're going to be amazing, you know that, right?" And I smiled and said, "I'm starting to believe it." And he said, "My parents want to know if we're free for dinner Sunday. My mom wants to celebrate your keynote in advance." And I felt that warmth I always felt when thinking about James's family, who'd welcomed me so completely and celebrated my successes so genuinely. And I said, "That sounds perfect." And we talked for a few more minutes about nothing important before hanging up, and I turned back to my computer where I'd been working on my conference speech. And the title slide read, "Innovation Through Authentic Leadership, Building Success on Your Own Terms." And I'd been writing from personal experience about the importance of knowing your worth even when others don't see it. And as I reviewed my notes, I thought about that version of myself standing in the ballroom 3 months ago, watching my sister make cruel comments about my supposed poverty. And I thought about how far I'd come, not just in title or salary, but in fundamental belief about who I was and what I deserved. The office was quiet as evening approached, and most people had left for the day. And I had a few more hours of work to do, but I wasn't tired. I was energized by work that mattered, and challenged me, and recognized my contributions. And I looked around at the office that still felt surreally mine with its modern furniture and walls I'd decorated with art I actually liked, and the bookshelf filled with industry publications and leadership books I was slowly working through. And I thought about how my wedding day had been a turning point, but not in the way I'd expected. Not just because Richard had publicly recognized my achievements, but because something had shifted in me during those confrontations with Vanessa and my mother. Some fundamental understanding that I didn't need their validation to know my worth, that I had always been enough, even when they couldn't see it. And now I finally believed it, in a way that wasn't dependent on external recognition or job titles or salary numbers. I was enough because of who I was, because of the integrity I brought to my work and my relationships, because of the kindness James saw in me, and the loyalty my friends valued, and the innovation Richard respected. And my family's inability to see those qualities wasn't a reflection of my worth, but of their limitations. And understanding that had freed something in me I hadn't known was trapped. And as I turned back to my presentation and began refining the conclusion, I knew I'd be speaking on Friday, not just as a successful VP sharing professional insights, but as someone who'd learned the hardest and most important lesson about believing in yourself, even when the people who were supposed to believe in you first simply couldn't. And I was ready to share that truth with an audience of people who might need to hear it, the way I'd needed to hear it for so many years. And outside my window, the city lights were beginning to glow in the dusk, and James would be here soon to pick me up for dinner, and tomorrow I'd have coffee with my father, and slowly continue building something real with him, while accepting that my mother and Vanessa might never be able to meet me where I was, and that was okay. I was okay. I was more than okay. I was finally exactly who I was meant to be.